Today we rank every major ground attack aircraft of the Second World War, from the worst machines that got crews killed, to the legends that changed the face of warfare forever. Starting the worst ground attack aircrafts. Number 20, Ferry Battle, United Kingdom. The Ferry Battle looked the part. Single engine, sleek lines, proudly bearing RAF roundels over France in the opening weeks of the war. It looked like it belonged. It didn't. Designed in the mid-1930s as a light bomber, it was already obsolete before the first shot was fired. When the Germans crossed into France in May 1940, RAF squadrons flying the battle were sent against the Maastricht bridges, heavily defended, crawling with flak, swarming with Messerschmitts. The losses were catastrophic. On May 12th alone, out of every aircraft sent, almost none came back. 2 crews won Victoria Crosses that day, posthumously. The battle carried a single .30 3-machine gun to defend itself against Bf-109s, against dedicated flak batteries. It was slower than the fighters hunting it, less maneuverable, and carried a bomb load that barely justified the risk of flying it. Pilots didn't fear the enemy in a ferry battle. They feared the aircraft itself. Ranking it 20th isn't harsh. It's honest. Number 19, Breguet 693, France. France entered the war believing it had a modern ground attack force. The Breguet 693 was supposed to be the proof. A twin-engine, low-wing attack aircraft. It was fast by French standards, reasonably armed, and looked genuinely threatening on the tarmac. Then it flew into combat. The 693 suffered from a fundamental problem that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. It was too fragile for the environment it was sent into. Ground attack means flying low and slow over defended positions, exactly where light flak is most lethal. The Breguet's cooling systems were vulnerable, its engines temperamental, and replacement parts were perpetually scarce in the chaotic French supply chain of 1940. In 6 weeks of fighting, the Armée de l'Air lost staggering numbers of these aircraft. Some units were combat ineffective within days. The aircraft wasn't the only reason France fell, but it certainly didn't help. Number 18, Ilyushin Il-2, Soviet Union. Wait, an IL-2 this low? Yes, but not all IL-2s are equal. The early single-seat production variants that went to war in 1941 had a fatal flaw built directly into their design. No rear gunner. The back of the aircraft was completely undefended. German fighter pilots quickly discovered this, and they exploited it with ruthless efficiency, attacking from behind in a shallow dive, where the IL-2's heavy frontal armor meant absolutely nothing. Soviet losses in those first months were devastating. Entire attack regiments were wiped out. The Soviets tried every workaround imaginable. Tight formation flying, escort fighters that were never available in sufficient numbers. But the problem remained. The IL-2 that would eventually become legendary hadn't been born yet. This version, the early naked defenseless version, was something closer to a flying coffin. The pilots who flew it knew it. They flew anyway, because the alternative was a court-martial or execution. Brave men. Terrible machine. For now. Number 17, Vultee A-35 Vengeance, United States, Britain. The Vengeance was built around a single tactical concept, the dive bomber. Steep, precise, devastating on paper, and in very specific, very controlled conditions, like close air support in Burma, where Allied air superiority was total. It actually performed adequately. But here's why it ranks near the bottom of this list. The Vengeance was a dedicated dive bomber in a war that was rapidly deciding dive bombing was tactically obsolete outside of naval operations. It had no meaningful ability to operate in contested airspace. It was slow in level flight, vulnerable to fighters, and its defensive armament was genuinely inadequate. The RAF used it in secondary theaters specifically because sending it anywhere the Luftwaffe was present would have been a massacre. The U.S. Army Air Forces took one look at it and largely passed, leaving the British and Australians to use it where the skies were mostly safe. An attack aircraft that can only operate when it doesn't need to fight isn't much of an attack aircraft. Number 16, Heinkel He-123, Germany. Here's something remarkable. The Germans went into Spain in 1936 with a biplane ground attack aircraft, and it worked. The He-123 was fast for a biplane, reasonably tough, and its open cockpit noise alone reportedly unnerved troops on the ground. But a biplane in 1939, then 1940, then somehow still flying in 1942 on the Eastern Front? That tells you something disturbing about availability, replacement rates, and Luftwaffe logistics. The He-123 ranked this low not because it was terrible in isolation, but because it existed as a stopgap in a war that had long since moved past it. Its pilots loved it for its reliability. Its commanders kept using it because they had nothing else. And every mission it flew was a reminder that Germany's ground attack doctrine was still catching up to its own ambitions. When your most available ground attack platform is a 1930s biplane, you have a problem. Number 15. Blackburn Skua, United Kingdom. The Skua holds the distinction of being the first British aircraft to shoot down a German aircraft in World War II. It also holds the distinction of being one of the most conceptually confused combat aircraft Britain produced. It was simultaneously a dive bomber and a fighter. It was mediocre at both. As a naval dive bomber, it was slow, with a limited bomb load, and its performance deteriorated sharply when carrier-borne with full ordnance. As a fighter, it couldn't catch anything the Luftwaffe was flying by 1940. The attack on the German cruiser Königsberg in Bergen Harbor in April 1940 was the Skua's defining moment. It sank the ship, a genuine achievement. But the losses on that operation hinted at a deeper problem. Against determined fighter opposition, the Skua was prey, not predator. Trying to be two things in a war that demanded specialists, the Skua ended up being neither. Number 14. Curtiss A-18 Shrike, United States. The Shrike was an American attack aircraft that never made it to war, not because it was held in reserve, but because by the time conflict arrived, it had already been quietly acknowledged as inadequate. Powered by twin radial engines that gave it reasonable speed, the A-18 looked capable enough on paper. But the USAC's own operational testing revealed persistent problems, limited range, inadequate firepower, and handling characteristics that made it difficult to employ effectively in the low-altitude attack profiles it was designed for. The U.S. military bought a modest production run, largely for evaluation purposes, and moved on. The Shrike became a training aircraft, which was perhaps the most honest assessment the Army could give it without holding a formal press conference to say, "We bought the wrong airplane." It ranks here because failure through obsolescence, before a single enemy bullet is fired, is still failure. Number 13. Fokker C.X, Netherlands. The Netherlands went to war in May 1940 with an air force that was already a generation behind the aircraft hunting it. The Fokker C.X was a biplane reconnaissance and light attack aircraft, honest, reliable, and utterly unprepared for what came across the border. Against the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and Do-17s, the C.X had no meaningful answer. Dutch pilots flew with ferocious courage against overwhelming odds during the 5-day campaign, and the C.X's losses were almost total. Not because the men failed, but because the machine gave them no margin for error, no speed advantage, no altitude advantage, and no firepower advantage. A nation sends its pilots to war. It owes them better than this. Number 12. Mitsubishi Ki-51 Japan. Japan entered the war with genuine confidence in its air power. That confidence was often justified. The Ki-51 was not one of the justifications. A single-engine reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft, it was slow even by 1941 standards, carried a light bomb load, and was never designed to operate in contested airspace against competent Allied fighters. In the China theater and early Pacific operations, it scraped through. Allied air power in those regions was initially thin, and the Ki-51 could function as long as the skies weren't seriously contested. But as Allied fighter strength grew, the Ki-51 became increasingly untenable for frontline attack work. By mid-war, it had been shuffled back to secondary roles and training. Japan desperately needed a modern, dedicated ground attack aircraft. The Ki-51 was a reminder of how far behind that need they had fallen. Number 11. Potez 633, France. France exported the Potez 633 to Greece and Romania even as it struggled to equip its own air force. which tells you something about how the French military-industrial complex prioritized its commitments in the late 1930s. As a light bomber and ground attack aircraft, the 633 was a product of optimistic 1930s thinking. Twin engines, decent speed, reasonable defensive armament. Against the realities of 1940 air warfare, that thinking collapsed almost immediately. It was too slow to evade modern single-engine fighters, too lightly armored to absorb punishment over defended targets, and its bomb load was insufficient to justify the risk of delivering it. The Greeks used it against the Italian invasion in 1940 with some success, because Italian air power in that campaign was also struggling. But against the Luftwaffe, the Potez 633 was simply outclassed. It ranks near the worst, because competent mediocrity in a war full of exceptional machines is, effectively, failure. Now starting the best ground attack aircrafts. Number 10, North American B-25 Mitchell, United States. When Jimmy Doolittle lifted off the deck of USS Hornet on April 18, 1942, in a medium bomber nobody believed could make that takeoff, the B-25 Mitchell announced itself to history. But the Doolittle raid was theater. The real story of the Mitchell as a ground attack weapon was written in the Pacific, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, where modified gunship variants carried enough forward-firing firepower to dismantle a convoy, a troop formation, or a coastal installation in a single pass. Some versions packed a 75mm cannon in the nose, a naval artillery piece in an aircraft, pointed at Japanese shipping. The results were as violent as they sound. The Mitchell was versatile, durable, twin-engined for survivability, and capable of operating in almost every theater where America fought. It earned its place near the top 10 through sheer adaptability. When your aircraft can be meaningfully modified to carry a field gun, you're working with a serious machine. Number 9, Bristol Beaufighter, United Kingdom. The Japanese nicknamed it Whispering Death. That should tell you everything. The Beaufighter wasn't designed as a pure ground attack aircraft. It began life as a heavy fighter and night fighter. But war has a way of reassigning aircraft to roles they weren't designed for. And in the Beaufighter's case, that reassignment was a revelation. Armed with 4 20mm cannons, 6.303 machine guns, rockets, and torpedoes, the Beau became one of the most feared low-level strike platforms in any theater. Over the Aegean, it hunted Axis shipping with rockets and cannons. Over Burma, it devastated Japanese supply lines. In Coastal Command, it was the weapon that made Axis convoy runs in the Mediterranean genuinely dangerous. It was fast enough to get in and out, powerful enough to destroy almost anything it found, and rugged enough to absorb punishment. Japanese troops in the Pacific heard it before they saw it, and by the time they saw it, it was usually too late. Number 8, Douglas SBD Dauntless, United States. Midway, June 4, 1942. 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, sunk in 6 minutes of dive bombing. A 4th, Hiryu, followed hours later. The entire strategic balance of the Pacific War shifted in an afternoon. The aircraft that did it was the SBD Dauntless, an aircraft the Navy had been planning to replace. Slow, open cockpit 2-man, with perforated dive flaps that rattled the airframe on every steep attack run. The Dauntless was not glamorous. It was not modern, but it was accurate. Devastatingly, historically, war-alteringly accurate. American dive bomber crews trained obsessively, and in the Dauntless, they had a platform stable enough to make that training matter. By the end of the war, the Dauntless had sunk more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft. The machine that was being phased out became the weapon that saved the Pacific. Some aircraft earned their place in history. The Dauntless owns it. Number 7, Hawker Typhoon, United Kingdom. The Typhoon very nearly didn't survive long enough to become legendary. In its early service, it suffered catastrophic structural failures, tails coming off in high-speed dives. Carbon monoxide leaked into cockpits. The engine was temperamental, unreliable, and prone to catching fire. The RAF came close to canceling the entire program. Then came D-Day, and the Typhoon found its calling. Armed with 8 60-pound rockets and 4 20mm cannons, the Typhoon became the nightmare of every German armored column in Normandy. At Falaise in August 1944, Typhoon squadrons systematically destroyed a trapped German army. Hundreds of vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, obliterated in hours. German tank crews began abandoning their vehicles at the sound of approaching typhoons, even before the rockets were fired. The psychological impact alone was a weapon. The Typhoon story is one of a deeply flawed machine that survived its own failures long enough to become irreplaceable. Number 6. Petlyakov PE-2, Soviet Union. The PE-2 never got the Western recognition it deserved. On the Eastern Front, it was everywhere. Designed as a high-altitude fighter and converted under Stalin's direct order into a dive bomber, the PE-2 was faster than most single-engine fighters it encountered early in the war. It was maneuverable, twin-engined, and capable of carrying a meaningful bomb load with genuine precision. More than 11,000 were built. Soviet aviation regiments flew it against panzer formations, rail yards, river crossings, and Luftwaffe airfields from 1941 through the fall of Berlin. Where the IL-2 was the hammer, the PE-2 was the scalpel, hitting precise targets that the armored Shturmovik couldn't reach. German fighter pilots respected the PE-2 enough to develop specific tactical doctrines for dealing with it. When your enemy writes procedures about how to kill your airplane, you're doing something right. Number 5. Junker Ju-87 Stuka, Germany. There is no other aircraft in World War II that created more psychological devastation per mission than the Stuka. The Ju-87 was not a sophisticated aircraft. It was fixed gear, slow, and entirely dependent on air superiority to survive. But paired with German air supremacy in Poland, France, the Balkans, and North Africa, it was a weapon of almost theatrical destruction. The Jericho trumpet, the siren fitted to its undercarriage, was a deliberate psychological tool designed to break the will of soldiers and civilians on the ground before the bombs even arrived. Hans Ulrich Rudel flew 2,530 combat missions in the Stuka. He destroyed over 500 Soviet tanks, 800 vehicles, and a battleship. He was shot down 30 times and survived. The most decorated German serviceman of the entire war flew this aircraft, in this machine, over the Eastern Front, until the very last days of combat. The Stuka is proof that a limited aircraft, used with absolute mastery in the right conditions, can transcend its limitations entirely. Number 4. Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, United States. Pilots called it the Jug. It weighed almost 7 tons fully loaded. It could absorb more punishment than almost any piston-engine aircraft of the entire war and keep flying. The P-47 began its career as an escort fighter, and a controversial one, since its range initially couldn't take it all the way to Berlin. But when it was reassigned to ground attack in the European and Pacific theaters, something became clear. The Thunderbolt was extraordinary at it. 8.50 caliber machine guns, rockets, and up to 2,500 pounds of bombs. Flying at low altitude, where its enormous radial engine was almost impossible to kill with small arms fire. The P-47 tore through German transport, rail networks, and armored columns in the weeks before and after D-Day, with devastating effect. Pilots trusted it to absorb a 20mm cannon shell and get them home. Trusted it to perform in the mud and chaos of close air support. In the hierarchy of trust between pilot and machine, few aircraft in any air force earned that trust more completely. Number 3. de Havilland Mosquito, United Kingdom. The Air Ministry told Geoffrey de Havilland his idea was absurd. A combat aircraft built from wood? No defensive armament? Relying purely on speed for survival? De Havilland built it anyway, and it became possibly the most versatile combat aircraft of the entire war. The Mosquito flew faster than most of the fighters sent to intercept it. It flew precision low-level attacks against Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen and The Hague, specific buildings, specific floors, releasing bombs with a precision that seemed impossible for 1944. It destroyed V weapon sites, attacked Rommel's headquarters, opened Amiens prison to free French resistance fighters, and flew Pathfinder missions over Germany at night that the Germans could barely track, let alone intercept. It was simultaneously a night fighter, a day bomber, a maritime strike aircraft, a photo reconnaissance platform, and a ground attack weapon of extraordinary precision, built from spruce and balsa, powered by Merlins, flown by crews who knew they were flying something genuinely different. When the Germans asked a captured RAF pilot what they feared most, the answer, reportedly, was the mosquito. Number 2. Ilyushin Il-2 Shturmovik, Soviet Union. Remember the early Il-2, the defenseless, crew-killing death trap from the beginning of this list? The Soviets fixed it. They fixed it in the most Soviet way imaginable, relentlessly, brutally, and at industrial scale. The two-seat Il-2 added a rear gunner. The AM-38 engine was progressively improved. Anti-tank versions carried 37mm cannons, specifically designed to punch through German Panzer rooftop armor, the thin part. At Kursk in July 1943, Il-2 groups flew circular attack patterns over German armored columns, each aircraft attacking in sequence, each targeting the vulnerable tops of tanks. Entire panzer formations were stopped. More Il-2s were built than any other military aircraft in history. Over 36,000. That number is not a coincidence. It reflects how absolutely central this aircraft was to Soviet survival and eventual victory. Stalin reportedly said that the Il-2 was as necessary to the Red Army as air and bread. German troops called it the Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. When you earn that name from the enemy, you've earned your ranking. Number 1. Hawker Hurricane, United Kingdom. Wait, the Hurricane? Not the Spitfire? Here's the truth that gets lost in the glamour of the Battle of Britain narrative. The Spitfire was a supreme air superiority fighter. The Hurricane was something the RAF needed just as badly, and arguably more practically, a workhorse that could do almost everything. As a ground attack platform, the Hurricane's evolution is one of the great unsung stories of the war. The Hurry Bomber variant carried bombs under its wings while retaining its 8 machine guns. The Mark IID, the tank buster, carried 240mm Vickers S guns, the largest cannon ever fitted to a single-engine British aircraft. In North Africa, these aircraft hunted Rommel's tanks and supply convoys with an effectiveness that genuinely influenced the Desert War's outcome. But here's why it earns the top of this specific ranking. The Hurricane was the most broadly deployed, most operationally flexible, and most combat-proven ground attack aircraft across the widest range of theaters of any aircraft in the war. It fought in France, Britain, North Africa, Malta, Iraq, East Africa, the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, India, and Burma. It adapted to every theater. It never stopped being useful. In a ranking of ground attack aircraft, not the best fighter, not the best bomber, but the best aircraft for putting ordnance on ground targets across real-world wartime conditions. The Hurricane's combination of durability, adaptability, pilot trust, and sustained effectiveness across 6 years, and every major theater places it at the top of this list. Not glamorous, not the one on the posters, just quietly, consistently, devastatingly effective. The best don't always get the credit. Sometimes history remembers the beautiful ones and forgets the ones who won. If you think another ground attack aircraft deserved a higher place on this ranking, let us know in the comments below. And for more World War II aviation rankings, legendary aircraft stories, and forgotten war machines, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.